Welcome to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology. Welcome to episode 8, where we begin a 4-part series on the doctrine of total depravity. Well, welcome to another episode of Mike and Mike Theology Plus. We are here to begin in all earnestness the discussion of the doctrine of grace, because we weren't before, because we didn't start with this topic.
Right, now we begin. Yep. 7 episodes in,
right.
We're starting.
So this is Total Depravity, the first of the doctrines covered by TULIP. We went over that acrostic before. TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, Total Depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
I will make you feel better. The Arminian version of TULIP is facts, and in the article that I read, they presented them out of order because they think that there's a logical order that's different from the acrostic. So there you go, you're an Arminian.
Poof, you're an Arminian. All right.
At least your logic is the same. So
did they start with, they just start with atonement, right?
No, they start with total depravity, actually.
Oh, they do?
That's just not the first letter in their acrostic.
Okay. So
maybe I'm an Arminian.
Yes, you're the Arminian too, yeah.
Crud.
Yeah, that's you. So total depravity, I think we need to first talk about what it's not. Lots of teachers, R.C. Sproul, one of them, will take total depravity, teach on it for about 5 minutes and say, and I don't like this word because it often gets misunderstood. So total depravity, is it everyone is as bad as possible?
No.
No, it's not that. It's not every person commits every possible sin.
Right. Rather,
it's that the full person, all of the person, all aspects of the person are touched by the fall. Mm-hmm. And I separated this in my mind physically and non-physically, because I think we suffer physical ailments that Adam and Eve wouldn't have pre-fall. And then there's non-physical aspects. And the non-physical part of us, some people call it the soul, some people call it the mind, some people call it the spirit. Yeah. And if we kind of take the different functions of our non-physical self, I think largely there's an agreement that we can talk about our intellect, our will or volition, and our emotion. And some people will use the word mind for intellect, and then some people will use the word mind for the soul or spirit. So you just got to be careful, how are we using the word mind? But we would agree that all three of those are touched by the fall.
So our brains fell.
Yes, in the physical. That would be under the physical part. Our brains can get Alzheimer's, whereas I don't think they could before. And then separately, our minds also fell, because physical, non-physical. Yeah.
There's background there.
All right, so
and maybe as we're setting out from the start and doing definitions, I've heard R.C. Sproul teach on this, and he ends up changing some of the terms in TULIP, and I've heard him go from TULIP to RULIP, so that the total depravity becomes something along the lines of radical inability, or I think he used radical effacement.
Radical corruption.
Right. So the total there is kind of the breadth of the depravity, in that it touches all aspects of it, and not necessarily the depth of the depravity. We're not all Hitler. And even Hitler
could have been worse.
Could have been worse, yeah. I mean, as awful as he was, and I'm not saying there's anything that he did that was good, but perhaps when he was young, he honored his parents in some way, mm-hmm. and he could have not done that instead. Right. So, yeah, it's. I would prefer, and I think the original teaching by Calvin deals more with the issue of ability, because all of our faculties as humans have been corrupted and are depraved, and so our ability to choose God or to respond to common grace is crippled, and our ability to see or understand the gospel, much less respond to it, is gone. So and I think that's going to come out in this discussion, because Arminians there's not one monolithic type of them. As we've encountered on Facebook in these discussions, pushing back with people recently, people that I would classify as Arminians say that they aren't because of total depravity, or they don't believe it, or there's all kinds of different nuances to it. So maybe, and I don't know if you find this to be helpful, but maybe this could be a conversation of monergism versus synergism. I think Calvinism and Arminianism are pretty analogous to that, and that's, in my mind, the discussion that is to be had of, are we totally depraved and unable or not?
Right. And I think for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to focus on man's condition. So are we able to choose? Mm-hmm. Because depending on which Arminian you're talking to, they're going to put the ability to choose in man, either in man's innate condition or his de facto condition once God gives everyone prevenient grace.
Right.
So just to kind of keep things separate, at least in my mind, we're going to put prevenient grace. We may talk about it some. It may come up. But really with what God does under unconditional election.
I think it touches both.
Yeah,
so I think it's going to
both.
come up today, but we'll see.
But yeah, so total depravity in my mind is really dealing with man's condition. And to be fair to a lot of Arminians I looked at, because when I was looking up stuff for limited atonement, there's lots of clear, thought out opposition that I could listen to limited atonement. And I anticipated the same would be available for total depravity. And what I found was there are a lot of Arminians who would say everything that we're going to say today, or almost everything we're going to say today, because they agree with man's initial condition. What they then do is then they put on top of it God's prevenient grace that says, okay, God gives us prevenient grace and it helps and enables all people. Almost think of like a cake where you put an icing on the top and you just kind of smooth it all over to kind of bring it all up to level. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not. But.
Right, and so what I would say is, yes, a lot of them, I could read this total depravity statement that's put out by some Arminians and probably agree with all of it. But if you then cancel or negate it all by prevenient grace, then in effect, you don't, in my opinion, you don't really believe in total depravity because no one actually exists in that state.
You believe in the theory of total depravity,
right?
But in practice, God has done away with it, which kind of makes you wonder why there's so many verses that deal with total depravity if it's not actually, if you can't go out and find it in the real world because God has covered it over.
Right. Although those verses seem to be talking about actual men and not theoretical men.
Right.
So that, and to me, so I think you would want to put the prevenient grace discussion more on unconditional election, whereas I think it kind of fits more heavily on the total depravity side, because in my mind, Calvinism and total depravity is teaching what man is or is not able to do. And then once they establish that man is unable, then unconditional election will follow kind of logically and from Scripture. I do think it bridges it. I think I weight it a little more towards the T, and you weight it a little more towards the U. But
yeah, and that's just me drawing boxes around stuff.
Right.
So.
And I draw circles. So.
All right, so all of this sin, where did sin come from?
The devil.
No, Eve.
Oh,
Eve.
Well, yeah.
It's all woman's fault, right? Yeah, so Adam, right?
Yeah. Well, but that is an interesting point, because Paul does make it very clear that Eve was tempted and Eve was led astray, and yet the Bible has one voice from start to finish that God comes to Adam and says, you are the one who is responsible here.
Right.
And I would take that to fall in line with covenant theology, and Adam is our federal head, and I think that makes the most sense of Romans 5. But not that that's particularly germane to this discussion, But I do find that interesting.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Adam sinned eyes wide open, knew what was going on. Eve Bible says she was deceived. So, but Adam, before the fall, we're going to whip out some fancy Latin, I think they're Latin phrases, was posse non peccare and posse peccare.
Right.
So posse, you can think of as meaning power to, or the possibility to. Able to. Non means non or not, or similar to our non prefix as we have in English. And peccare means like flesh, sin. And so what these Latin phrases mean is that Adam, it was possible, he was able to remain sinless, or he was able to sin. Mm-hmm. He had a choice. We would say he could choose one or the other. He chose to sin. And then after that choice, he became non posse, non peccare, not possible to be not sinful.
While still maintaining posse peccare.
Say that.
If you draw it up on a diagram, mm-hmm. you have like posse peccare, or you have peccare and non peccare, mm-hmm. and then you look at Adam pre-fall, post-fall, which is all of us, mm-hmm. and then us saved but here, and then us glorified, and then us glorified, we are restored to posse non peccare, and we get non posse peccare. So we're able not to and not able to. So it kind of says the same thing, but if you draw it out, you can see the same stages kind of across the 4 different categories.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's possible for him to sin.
And it's not possible for him to not sin.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like, you threw me for. That's okay.
It's a bit redundant for man in this fallen state. I'll give
you
that.
I was like, what am I missing?
No,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, but then Christ comes along, who is not the progeny of Adam. He doesn't have Adam as his federal head because he's virgin born, and so he is as God the Son, non posse peccare. It's not possible for him to sin, and we could have a long podcast on just that. We're not going to. We're gonna.
Yeah. Is this like where we do a cut?
Yeah, cut. All right, and we're back. So out of that, what we're claiming to begin with is it's not possible for Adam or Adam's progeny to be sinless. It's not possible for us to be sinners. And so I think right here we want to deal with those who might disagree. Okay. So there was a guy that lived a long time ago named Pelagius, who said that, we got it wrong. We're born good, and that Adam's fall didn't really directly affect us. He was just a bad example for us. And so as we grow up, we live in this long line of bad examples, and so we see our parents being bad examples, and so we're also bad examples. But we're actually perfect when we're born. He also believed in that God created each individual soul on the spot as babies were conceived. And so part of his reasoning was that God couldn't create a sinful soul. And so he believes that you could be perfect and or turn to God on your own. And so we would disagree with that. And I'm going to read it. I'm not going to give the full reason why, because that is the majority of the podcast. Then there's also partial Pelagianism, and I'm a dualist. I'm not a tripartist, or however that word is pronounced. So I believe in physical, non-physical. Some folks hold to a physical body and then a non-physical that's in 2 parts, your soul and your spirit. They get that primarily out of the scripture that says that the word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, able to cut asunder both the sword and the spirit and the soul and the joints and the marrow. Other than that one verse, I can think of no other verse that puts the soul and the spirit in opposition to each other. In fact, they're used synonymously throughout the Bible. And taking the scripture, it seems like Paul, being Paul, is doing hyperbole there, even able to cut the sword in the soul and the spirit. So
you mean the writer of Hebrews heard Paul say that?
Did I say Paul? Yes. Sorry.
There's background there too.
Actually, I don't think Paul wrote Hebrews. I just slipped.
But would you say it's Pauline or is it Pauline?
I would say it's Apollosine. Okay. All right. So, but those who do hold to a soul and spirit and body, some of them will say our spirit is untouched by the fall. And so it's like there's this island within us that's not touched. So you'd say partial depravity instead of total depravity. These people are known as semi-Pelagianist or partial Pelagianist. Both of these were decided were heresies.
Yep.
So I'll turn to our local historian. You want to talk about
real quick, Pelagius, I think it was Jerome who said he was an Irish monk. If I have my dates correct, I think he was born in the same year as Augustine. Travels to Rome as an adult and is disgusted when he sees the licentiousness that's being practiced by the church there. And is particularly scandalized when he reads Augustine's comment to praying to God. I think it's in his Confessions where he says, God, command what you will and grant what you command, or maybe grant what you command and command what you will. And he says, that doesn't make any sense. We have to be able to, if God says, I'm commanding to do X, then we must be able to do X. And so there's a decent bit of back and forth. Initially, he actually is held up as Orthodox. There was a council of Diaspalus, I think. I think it's also called the Council of Lud in 415. It seems to me to be a little bit of they didn't know the right questions to ask, because only 3 years later in the Council of Carthage, he is in fact condemned. And then that condemnation is ratified or upheld at the Council of Ephesus in 431. So they say, no. Basically, Pelagius was saying we can do it without grace.
And I read that the Eastern Church had their own council, but didn't condemn him. And the church at the time said, well, it's just because there weren't witnesses there to condemn them. So there's a little bit of people who still are pro-Pelagius say, look, the Eastern Church didn't condemn him, and those who are against say, well, yeah, it's because people didn't go to testify against him. So
I'm not that familiar with these councils.
That's familiar because I read this other article which we're going to talk about.
Well, I will say, when you get into what happened at some of the councils, you do get some kind of funky and weird behavior.
Because it's not always theological. Sometimes it's political.
Oh, I would say at least half of what goes on at these councils. I mean, you hear about the Robber Council, and there's one time where a group is on the way and they're late, so their opposition's already there, so they convene the council, condemn them, excommunicate them, and then close it before the other group arrives, and then they arrive and go, what are you doing? We're going to hold and it's craziness. There's a good one with Athanasius coming before Constantine and a lot of theater. You've got Cyril and Nestorius, and was Nestorius even a Nestorian? So there's lots of odd stuff that goes on. I would say that he wasn't guilty of what they say that he was, but we are far afield from total depravity. So, weird stuff happens at the councils. What you're saying, I've never heard before, but sounds very reasonable.
That's what Lewis Lofton says.
No, I'm not arguing by saying I haven't heard it. That's just those councils.
All I'm saying for my defense is, if that's wrong, it's because I listened to this guy, Lewis Laughlin.
Well, but that sounds very reasonable for something that could have happened.
Right. Yeah. All right, and then did you want to talk about semi-Pelagianism?
Yeah, I think there may be a couple different things that are called semi-Pelagianism. The one that I was researching was basically saying we have the ability to choose God initially, And so the initial work of faith is our own, and then thereafter, growing in faith is something that requires God's help, which I find to be interesting and almost exactly backwards from our position. Right? Not that we grow in faith on our own, that we're not helped, but that I would say our sanctification is a cooperative process.
Correct.
Where God works in and through us, but
synergistic.
I'm very comfortable with synergism in sanctification, and monergism in justification, which I guess is kind of what they're saying, but the monergism is all on our side,
right,
in the one that I saw. Anyway, as far as I could tell, and again, this is a little later than most of the reading I've done, but that was condemned at the Second Council of Orange in 529. So the church early on was actually very consistently Augustine. Even in the councils, they seem to really uphold it and love Augustine, even as throughout the Middle Ages they slipped away from his firm grasp on justification by faith alone through grace alone.
They still liked him.
It's kind of this weird thing where we love Augustine. I haven't read him. I don't really know what he says, but we love Augustine. So they did, at council after council, continue to say things that were very Augustinian.
So just to bring this home, and why would we be talking about this? I will say in our local area in Charleston, there is at a well-known Christian school, which will remain unspoken on camera, that there was if you see me out of camera, I'll tell you. There at least was, if not currently is, a Bible teacher who teaches partial Pelagianism, that he's a tripartist. He's spirit, soul, and body, and he believes that the spirit is unfallen, and that is how you are able to choose. That's where your ability to choose from comes from, which has been, at least in the councils, declared a heresy. All right, so real quickly, and I'll link this in the description. I looked for some defenses of Pelagianists. I only found this one. Admittedly, this guy is pretty terrible. So if
is
you're
it
like,
David Brandos?
No, no. So like I was telling you, I think there's probably got to be someone who is in favor of Pelagius that is at least better at using logic and stuff, and would come with the more recent. I feel like this is almost like a caricature.
So what you're saying is we're trying to be fair, and this is as fair as you were able to research?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. So he goes through kind of a background on what is Pelagianism and what was Pelagius, what did he do. Then he sets out these 5 tenets of Pelagianism. God has decreed to save through Jesus Christ those fallen. Christ died for all men, not just the elect, but no one except the believer has remission of sin. So, good extent application from last time. Man can neither of himself nor of his free will do anything truly good until he is born again. All good deeds or movements in the regenerate must be ascribed to the grace of God, but his grace is not irresistible. Those who are incorporated into Christ by a true faith have the power given them by assisting grace of the Holy Spirit to preserve in the faith, but it is possible for a believer to fall in grace.
You mean persevere?
What did I say?
Preserve?
Yeah, preserve. That's like the stuff you put on your bread.
Yeah. Tasty.
Yeah, it's good. So then he goes into a section on why was Pelagius right. And so I have those in our local study group. I color code stuff. So green is good and red is bad.
Unless it's in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
He uses a red pen in the Bible. It doesn't mean the same thing.
Well, it still means bad, but it's like where someone makes a bad choice. Like this is sinful. Like
you're not arguing with God.
Right, yeah. Or the writers. So he starts out saying Protestants claim the Bible is the sole authority of God. Got it. And considering the hostility of both Protestants and Catholics towards Pelagius, we must turn to the Bible. Okay, I'm there.
I actually taught on that this morning.
Yeah. And so his first thing is Adam was created liable to death and would have died had he, whether he had sinned or not. Now, this, I don't know why this weighs in directly on this topic, but he's saying that Adam was created where he could physically die. I have some probably not mainstream views on that. But I don't see how this plays into what we're discussing, so I'm not going to discuss this. But he does in this paragraph say, it seems God never intended humans to be immortal, which throws away any idea of life after death, bodily resurrection, into question. So from the get-go, We've got
other problems.
Yeah, this guy, that's why I'm saying this is probably not the best representative, but it was the only representative I could find. So why are we talking about salvation if you don't believe there's life after death?
Salvation unto what?
Yeah. Then he goes on to say, the fact is that Jesus himself never mentions Adam or any fall in the gospel. Well, I have several references here where Jesus talks about the sinfulness of man. The Sermon on the Mount, he says, lest your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, which would have been, it's impossible for, in that day and age, people looked at him as nigh unto perfection. You will in no case enter in the kingdom of heaven. John 6:44, which I'm sure we'll get to, says, unless a person gets drawn, they can't come to me. Luke 18, which we taught on Wednesday night, there's a rich young ruler. He says, go sell all your gifts. And he's like, goes away. And he says, well, it's more easy for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for rich men to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples were like, how can that be? Like,
it can't be done.
Right. How can anyone be in that? So they are shocked by the force of his statement. And he says, but with God, all things are possible. So,
Mark 7, from within, out of the heart of man come, and this is maybe the longest vice list that I know of.
That Jesus says?
Jesus says, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Why?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, this is a completely unrelated argument. I don't want us to get off course, but frequently in our society today, you'll hear stuff like, well, Jesus never said homosexuality was wrong. And one, I take issue with that because I think if you go to Matthew 19, he sets out a positive example that excludes a negative example. But two, he was talking to Jews who knew the law. He didn't have to, there's a lot of stuff that he may not have addressed directly because there was a common presuppositional understanding of God has spoken, and if it's back here, and by the way, Jesus is the Word, then he doesn't have to reiterate everything in the New Testament in order for us to think.
If it's not broken, you didn't have to fix it.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
So,
this guy gets worse, though.
Oh, goodness.
He says
I'm glad you didn't prep me for this.
The entire concept of God sacrificing his son, an innocent person. Oh, sorry. I got ahead of myself. So then he goes, we will get to that quote. Then he says, the Apostle Paul invented this entire concept of Adam causing humans to lose immortality. They never had in the beginning and was so now he's going to go on to say that he's going to pit Paul against Jesus and say that Paul and Jesus have different understandings. But let's go back up to his first thing. The Bible is the sole authority on God. So if you're going to throw out all of the Pauline New Testament and then misinterpret Jesus, it's going to be easy for you to make your case.
So Adam was mortal. There is no life after death. Jesus and Paul
are in opposition.
Paul is making stuff up.
So yeah, this, like I said,
I'm not sure we can get to the defense of Pelagianism.
I know. He says, even before the coming of Christ, there were some men who were sinless. I guess he's thinking of Enoch, maybe Daniel, Joseph. We get these men where God says something, the scriptures say something, and he was, there's no fault found in him. Okay, what did those passages mean? Obviously, I don't think they meant what this guy thought they meant in light of our other passages. I'm not even going to read some of this because it's just whack.
I'm not arguing.
Yeah, this brings up one of the most thorny issues for Christian dogma in that all of those prior to Jesus are burning in hell for the mere fact that they were born before Jesus was ever conceived. Like,
that's not what Christians believe.
Where do you get this stuff? So,
but at least he has a hell. Yeah. I'm sure that's only a theoretical straw man for him.
Yeah. Infants at their birth are in the same state as Adam before the fall.
So that is interesting, because I think that becomes a little bit of a tough issue that we do end up having to deal with, and I'm not sure we can come to a full set of answers conclusively, but I think people kind of tend to want to drift in that direction and have some kind of an age of accountability, or all infants who die in infancy are saved universally, and that I think is not for today, but probably a good issue to delve into a little bit more, because I'm not sure that lends itself to easy, pat, cut and dry answers.
Yeah, I don't think it does either.
I don't think he's right, but
something that somewhere in these pages, I'm not going to go back to find it. There's one other point he makes where in the law it says, you can't punish a child or a grandson for the father's sin,
and vice versa.
Right, yeah. And so he's saying, well, how could Adam sin? Why is God judging us for that? And that's, on one view, that's not even what we're saying. We're saying Adam's sin's natural consequence fell to all of us because we were in Adam, and he's our federal head. That
passage isn't dealing with covenant headship and representation.
Right.
It's dealing with
he's
individual justice and culture. So
right. But that's not even. It's not as though we come out sinless, and God is going, oh, but Adam, your great grandfather was a sinner, so boom, you're getting judged too. It's a misrepresentation of what we're saying.
Yeah.
And then finally, he says that the law is the way to heaven. That throughout Jesus' ministry, he talks about one jot or one tittle won't fall away from the law until all be fulfilled.
Yes, it's almost like there's the rest of that story.
Yeah, but it seems like he missed. Well, I guess if you throw Paul out, you don't have to listen to Paul in Galatians, who says that the law is the schoolmaster telling us that we are not perfect. There's many purposes of the law. It's not just to tell us that we're bad, but that is one of the primary purposes of it, is that when we are put a mirror in front of us, we go, oh, I can't do that, I'm not a good person. I'll just say he confuses the passages of talking about good works that a believer might do once they are saved with good works that might merit salvation. Those are two different categories. Yeah. So,
and I know Galatians is your favorite book, so I bet you can probably quote 2:21.
I'm not that I can tell you some probably what it's saying, but I won't dare to quote it.
It says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. And there's elsewhere where Paul says, by the works of the law will no flesh be justified. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Yeah. So can we, and quite honestly, are we really dealing with Pelagianism?
Well, yes, we are. We're not going to take it up. I think that's it. Yeah. There are Arminians out there who are Pelagianist, or semi-Pelagianist. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but I don't think that's the bulk of them. So the people, like the podcasts I listened to from Remonstrance, they would go, yeah, you just totally misrepresented our views. I'm not trying to represent your views. There are a lot of Arminians who would, like we said at the beginning, agree with everything we're about to say about the man, and then they add prevenient grace to it, or some type of grace to it. So, but there are those out there that I wouldn't want to just skip over that view. It's out there. So that really comes down to, does man have the free will on his own to choose to follow God or not? Mm-hmm. And we would say no, he doesn't. Anything you want to add on those?
No, I think we've beaten that dead horse.
Good. And even if you don't agree with the teachings of Pelagius, if you have a better resource of someone who is defending it better than Lewis Laughlin, then I'm happy to take a look at that. You can comment in either our video cast or our podcast. Thanks for listening to this episode, our first on the doctrine of total depravity. Tune in next time for part 2. You've been listening to Mike and Mike Theology Plus, the podcast where we talk about all things related to Christian theology.